So empathy, empathy, empathy. This is the sort of the conversation on which the whole narcissism thing and what happens to people in narcissistic relationships sort of spins around. And one of the biggest pieces of confusion is this, when we think of narcissism, and you've heard me say it, like I'll go through the laundry list of stuff, right? The entitlement, the grandiosity, not only me, but other people. But the piece that always keeps coming up is a lack of empathy. And it's tricky because I think that what ends up happening is when a person shows any empathy, people then say, well, they can't be narcissistic because they're not supposed to have empathy. So what I'm hoping in this video is to sort of clear up both sides of this empathy mess, for lack of a better way to put it. I'm going to start by talking about the low empathy stuff, right? Empathy is so important. It's how we connect. It's how we feel heard. It's how we feel seen. On our very worst days, if somebody is empathic toward us, it's a game changer. It could be what makes that day feeling like one of the worst days we've ever had to feeling like, okay, I'm going to get through to the other side. It is necessary for attachment. It is necessary for healthy development. It is necessary for healthy relationships. So where empathy goes south, though, is very much in these narcissistic and narcissism adjacent relationships. But there's a lot of ways that empathy can kind of spin out in different directions. And I can see that this is what's confusing, what's become an incredibly confused conversation about narcissism, particularly in social media spaces. So let's talk about what happens to empathy and narcissism first. When you have a narcissistic person, they don't lack empathy. It's not like their empathy doesn't exist. They have something that's typically called cognitive empathy, okay? Cognitive empathy is understanding, intellectually understanding someone's emotions. So it would be the kind of thing where you hear somebody's mother died that they loved. Somebody's mother died. You would understand, not knowing that person, having no relationship with them, that they're sad or they're upset, right? You understand. I understand why they feel that way. And any of you who've ever been in a narcissistic relationship would get thrown like, you understand why I feel that way? Cognitive empathy almost doesn't feel like empathy. It's like the Splenda of empathy. Kind of tastes a little bit sweet, but isn't really sugar. It feels like empathy because like someone's kind of describing your emotion correctly, but it doesn't feel connected. The other problem with narcissism is not only whatever empathy you see, cognitive empathy, it tends to be relatively low. And even, again, that because cognitive empathy doesn't really feel like the real thing, but it's typically not what it needs to be, even though it's not completely absent. And it's variable. And that variable part is what throws people off. Because many people will say, I can't say they lack empathy because early in our relationship this, or after they got that promotion and we went on that vacation that. When narcissistic people, when things are going exactly the way they want them, and I mean exactly the way they want them, they're getting the praise, the admiration, the validation, that sense of specialness is being achieved in their lives. They get a bonus, they get a lot of money, they get the house they want, some material thing, whatever it may be, attention for something, fame, call it what you will. When that's happening, they're having an A+ day. And when they're having an A+ day, they can sometimes feel really attuned. There's sort of a kind of an excitement that sort of takes them over. They're happy, like we say it, well supplied. And when that happens, they can actually almost attend to what someone else is going through, and almost have it feel like they care. And those of you who've especially been in mild and moderate narcissistic relationships, you've seen this happen over and over again. So it's like, gosh, there's times like they have no empathy at all, but I must be reading this wrong because they were actually really nice 2 weeks ago when we were on that vacation. That kind of like woo of empathy, that kind of sine wave up and down, call it what you will. That's very much a hallmark of narcissism. Now, the more severe the narcissism gets, the more consistently low the empathy is, okay? But when you're in that mild to moderate range, especially that cognitive empathy, it's around. Also, when we talk about narcissistic folks, we get into some of that dark empath territory. And the dark empath is somebody who looks empathic, again, that cognitive empathy. But the empathy is actually even more manipulative. Like they're empathizing with you, but it almost feels like they're getting data from you, and they learn what's wrong, what is upsetting for you, and they learn what triggers you, and they learn what matters to you. And then what you'll end up finding is that the empathy sort of melts into a manipulation. And so they will learn, for example, that, I don't know, certain holidays matter to you a lot, right? And so they will maybe even make a really big deal about that holiday, but then they may also turn around and say, what are you, like 6? Like, why does Christmas matter so much to you? So it's like a boom, boom. They'll pay attention to it in a way that matters, but then they'll use it as a weapon. Another might be, and this is probably a more key example we see in narcissism and why so many people get drawn into these relationships. You'll meet someone and they'll learn pretty early on how you're sort of a little, I don't know, maybe you doubt your intelligence, or you doubt how smart you are. You have low self-esteem around that. And maybe it's because a family of origin kept poking fun of you, at you, or telling you were dumb, whatever the reasoning is. And maybe you're going to school, graduate school or law school or something like that. And the narcissistic person during the love bombing phase will say things like, I can't believe your family never thought you were smart. Like, you're a genius. You're totally brilliant. I can't believe, you're so amazingly smart. If that's your thing, there's no love bomb that's more powerful than that, right? Saying to you the thing that sort of hits that vulnerability. Here's where it gets tricky. The dark empath piece then becomes, let's say then, time goes on, you finish school, you get a great job, right? But that job is either going to mean you have to move a little farther out, or the hours are going to be tough, whatever it may be. Now the narcissistic person will say, "Ooh, I know you're really smart. Like, you sure you're going to be able to handle this one? Like, this feels like it's going to be really demanding." It feels like concern, but now they're doubting this variability that they were once praising. So that dark empath stuff, very much a signature move of narcissistic, especially more severe malignant narcissistic folks. But the point I want to make there on the empathy with the narcissism is that it's low and it's variable, but it's not absent. So for those of you who are saying, oh, I don't think this person has a narcissistic style, maybe it's not that bad, because they are empathic sometimes. They are empathic sometimes is very much a narcissism kind of a signature. But what about these people with no empathy? What are they about? And here's where we get into things like psychopathy. Psychopathy, or being a psychopath, is a very, very, very unusual pattern. These are people who will engage in harm towards other people with absolutely no care, no guilt, or remorse. You're like, oh, no, but narcissistic person hurts me. They do that and they don't care. They actually kind of do, believe it or not. They still do it. But they do feel guilt because they feel shame. Narcissistic people don't want to be viewed as not nice people. It's very important for them to be viewed well. Psychopathic people, not so much. Very callous, cruel, calculated, but there's still that superficial charm and intelligence. That's how they can draw people in. But when we talk about the absence of empathy, we're talking about a pretty low number of people, less than 1% in the population. And it is rare because human beings kind of need empathy to kind of go through the day. Psychopathic people are able to sort of really performatively fake it, but it feels kind of robotic. It feels American Psycho-ish. It feels distant. It's not like the narcissistic people. When they're on and they're happy and they're well supplied, their empathy actually almost tracks like empathy-ish. This isn't Splenda. This is nothing. Like, you're like, what is this? Like, it feels kind of gross, serial killery, scary, cold, awkward. When a psychopathic person may be using that charm to maybe get something done, it still sort of feels like scary Bond villain kind of thing. So that's psychopathy. What about other places, though, where empathy seems off? We can see forms of neurodivergence, and this could include territory like ADHD and autism spectrum, where there's a social processing issue at times, particularly autism spectrum. Now, here we're not talking about the absence of empathy, But what we might be talking about is a processing of social cues in a way that the response that's generated may feel abrupt or may not feel empathic to the other person in the conversation. Now, here's an interesting split off between autism spectrum and narcissism. If you were to tell a narcissistic person that their response was not empathic, they will rage at you. If a person is neurodivergent, autism spectrum being an example, and you then identify to them and say, whoa, that hurt me, that was not empathic, you're much more likely to see the person be contrite and apologetic. Like, I didn't mean that. I'm sorry. I didn't understand. In essence, it's almost like I didn't get it. I didn't understand. And the work that we know on theory of mind, Baron Cohen's work and all of that, we know that some of the work we'll see the therapeutic and the words I want to use here. Some of the ways that folks with autism spectrum may work on this to facilitate relationships for them is to learn that. And what you will sometimes see is a very earnest attempt to not do that again. So it's not, whereas in narcissism, you might see this literally almost a contempt for another person. In something, a neurodivergence like autism spectrum, it's like a not knowing due to a social processing issue in a relationship. The fourth bucket, where we might see less than optimal empathy, is a whole host of other psychiatric issues. Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, various forms of post-traumatic stress, psychotic disorders, addiction. Mental illness can often lead a person to turn very much within, right? These are people who are experiencing despair and struggle and preoccupation. And when those things are happening, the thing that a person's not going to be is attuned to other people. So what we might see then is periods when, for example, if a person is an addict and they're either preoccupied with getting drugs or alcohol or recovering from the effects of drugs or alcohol or acutely intoxicated with drugs and alcohol, you're not going to see empathy then. So only in these tiny windows of time when they're not sort of caught in one of those three states, you may see that, but oftentimes you will not. In a person who's depressed, the rumination and the preoccupation and the apathy, that can, again, it's a preoccupation, it's a turning inward. When we're talking about anxiety, people with anxiety are incredibly preoccupied. They're worried, they're monitoring their environments, they're thinking about the future. That's often going to pull them out of noticing other people. Well, you might even see something similar in something like OCD, where the obsessions and compulsions supersede other people. The need to get to address that discomfort. But in all those cases, especially depression, anxiety, disorders like OCD, we even see in post-trauma. We might see what seems like a diminished empathy, and that can often be because we sort of see this sort of dissociation and numbing that could lead a person to seem like they're cut off from other people, right? And that can be read as a lack of empathy by others. We do know that if a person post-trauma goes through trauma-informed treatment and is able to get out of those dissociated states and more of a regulated state where they're able to feel safe while being present with emotion, we'd see some of that lift, okay? But in most of those states, psychotic disorders, depression, anxiety, OCD, post-traumatic stress, even addiction, there's no contempt for the other person. It's a sort of a preoccupation, and preoccupation characterizes a lot of mental illness, okay? That's all the low empathy stuff. And you can see how this gets messy because the low variable empathy we see in narcissism is sort of its own kind of confusing animal because when it's on, it sort of feels like it's really on. And in these other things I'm describing, there's something else going on that very clearly can show you, oh, I see why this is happening. But let's now flip this. What about people who have empathy? One of the big problems is some people have too much empathy. And you're like, how can there be too much empathy? There can be too much empathy. When your empathy out is going to the point of exhaustion, and there's almost none of it coming in, that's too much empathy. When a person feels so empathically over-attuned to other people, Any form of boundary setting feels impossible. Even being in the world feels uncomfortable. Being in public spaces, even noises and things like that in the world, that can feel overwhelming. Feeling so affected by other people that if you were to be in the presence of someone who is having a sad day, you can't break out of it. Like it actually changes your mood in a significant way. Where you give and give and give because it feels uncomfortable to do otherwise. That can be sort of a too much empathy kind of a situation. And you may actually make sacrifices on your side that would put you in peril. Giving up money, giving up time. You're forever other people's shrink. They call you up, they're willing to give them 3 hours on the phone. But then where's the time for you? And before you know it, you're working late that night or things in your life aren't getting done. Some of you are listening are like, whoa, 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 Dr. Ramani. This sounds like you kind of have to be this way to be in a narcissistic relationship. And here's where we see another. So I'm saying this empathy thing's real messy. So we see another split here. There are people who are hyper empathic, who manage to get into narcissistic relationships, and then they get stuck. Heaven help them, because it's constant excuse making and justification, and I feel guilty, and maybe they had a tough childhood, and da-da-da-da. You know, I mean, you all know who you are, right? You've always been this. Now, could this have been a byproduct of growing up with a narcissistic parent or in a traumatizing, adverse childhood circumstance? Yes. Is it possible for some of you it was a temperamental style, like agreeableness gone wild? Sure. Then there's a group, though, where this hyper-empathic way of being could potentially be a byproduct of even an adult narcissistic relationship, where boundaries never worked. Trauma bonding meant you kind of had to be their shrink. You felt like, okay, maybe if I was more empathic, it becomes a strategy versus simply who you are. But then one day you look up and you're like, I just gave away 30 years of my life. So that takes us down to the final landing space, which I wish everyone was like this, because the world would be so boring, but so much better, which is everyone has a healthy level of empathy. And you might wonder, well, what the hell is that? A healthy level of empathy is that capacity to remain emotionally aware and attuned to other people, but also not take it on as a personal burden to fix that for everyone. One of the biggest things we had to do in graduate school was learn that. We spent years, 10 years, learning how to try to help people, but not take it all home. To show up and be trained and be our best therapist there for the hours we were doing it, but also be able to recognize that the zones of my life where you're taking care of your family or you're taking care of your life, that's separate. That sort of separation of I can be present with someone, I can be attuned to someone, but it's not my responsibility to rescue them. That I can set an appropriate boundary because I'm separate from this other person. Healthy empathy does sometimes slow us down. It might mean like, I think I better stay on the phone with this person a little longer. They're going through something. But then it may mean that like, I think I might have to sort of call it on this day. So there's a sort of a self-compassion built into healthy empathy. One of the challenges is I have no doubt that a lot of people who get into relationships, especially with narcissistic or psychopathic people, have healthy empathy. But the only way to survive in the relationship until you understand what these dynamics are is to lean more and more and more and more to an unhealthy empathy, too much of it, to the point it's harming you. And a lot of that is related to trauma bonding and survival and the belief that maybe it can change, and sometimes safety. And I have argued that empathy in some ways is a safety response for people who are in narcissistic relationships, thinking, well, I've got to connect to this person because they're the only game in town. They are my spouse, they're my family member, whatever it is. So the empathy then, turning on that empathy, over-empathizing, having lots of emotional empathy and compassion and all of that will allow you to remain connected to someone you have to be connected to. So as this really was one of those, I always call one of these videos sort of one of my shower moments. I was like literally drawing it on the shower glass and realizing that, wow, like the reasons people don't always have intact empathy or good empathy or healthy empathy or any empathy, it ain't always narcissism. And the trickiest piece of all is that the narcissistic people can sometimes show up with what feels like real empathy. And what we've got to remember is that I think a lot of us are sort of empathy, like heat-seeking missiles, but for empathy. If anyone is showing us any kind of understanding, we often are like, okay, they're empathic, versus watching that kind of ebb and flow. That ebb and flow, that's what you see in narcissism. And it's why those of you who say they can't be narcissistic because sometimes they're empathic, anyone who says sometimes they're empathic and sometimes they really aren't, that might actually be the signature of the narcissistic relationships. Anyhow, that was a lot of me yammering on about empathy. If you have any thoughts about it, drop them in the comments. Otherwise, thanks again.